He told everyone I had nothing without him, that his name, his connections, and his generosity were the only things keeping me afloat in the glittering shark tank of the city. He said it with a patronizing smile, a casual hand on my back, a toast at a dinner party where all eyes were on him, and by extension, on the quiet, unassuming woman he kept by his side. He truly believed it. And now, standing in the middle of the penthouse apartment he called his, with his perfectly tailored suit and a look of dismissive finality, he was making it my reality. "It's over, Seraphina," he said, the words as polished and cold as the marble beneath my feet. "I think it's best you pack your things. You have a week. I'm sure you'll land on your feet, eventually." He thought he was leaving me homeless, casting me out of the paradise he'd built. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly comprehend, was that he wasn't just breaking up with me, he was being evicted. He just didn't know I was the one who owned the building he lived in, the very floor he stood upon, and the air he breathed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence Julian left in his wake was more profound than any sound. It was a vacuum, sucking the warmth from the air, the color from the panoramic view of the skyline that stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. I stood motionless, my hand still clutching the handle of the porcelain teacup I'd been warming my hands with. It was a simple, elegant cup, one I'd chosen myself from a small artisan shop downtown. Julian had hated it. "It doesn't match the aesthetic, darling," he'd said, waving a dismissive hand. "We have the Versace set for a reason. Image is everything." He'd said that a lot. It was his mantra, the guiding principle of his meticulously curated life. My teacup, with its subtle, hand-painted imperfections, was a discordant note in his symphony of polished surfaces and brand-name prestige. Now it felt like the only real thing in the room. Hee-hew. I stared at the door he'd just closed behind him, a slab of solid oak that whispered of wealth and security. He hadn't slammed it. Julian never did anything so crude. His exits, like his entrances, were always smooth, controlled, and designed for maximum effect. This one was meant to convey a sense of regretful finality, the sad but necessary act of a man moving on to bigger and better things. He was already on his way to a gala at the museum, an event he'd described as critically important for visibility. He'd told me my presence wasn't required. "It's a high-level networking event, Seraphina. You'd be bored," he'd explained, as if protecting me from the complexities of his world. The truth, I now understood, was that he was debuting his new life, and it didn't include me. A week. He'd given me a week to dismantle a life I had, in my own quiet way, built for us. A week to pack up my books, my clothes, my offensive teacups, and disappear from the penthouse that had been my home for 3 years. I walked slowly through the cavernous living space. Every object was a testament to Julian's taste, or, rather, his idea of what taste should be. The sprawling white leather sofa, so uncomfortable it was practically an art installation. The chrome and glass coffee table, perpetually smudged with fingerprints that the twice-daily cleaning service fought a losing battle against. The abstract painting on the far wall, a chaotic splash of angry reds and blacks that Julian had purchased for an obscene amount of money because the artist was the next big thing. He didn't like the painting. He liked what owning it said about him. He was a man of foresight, of influence, a cultural tastemaker. I had always found the painting unsettling, a visual representation of a scream. Now it seemed appropriate. My life, the one I had shared with him, was a carefully constructed fiction, and the final page had just been brutally torn out. He'd told everyone I had nothing without him. It had started subtly, a joke here, a condescending remark there. At dinner parties, when someone would ask what I did, he'd jump in before I could answer. "Seraphina is a freelance writer," he'd announce, with a proud, proprietary smile. "She has a wonderful little blog. I'm her biggest supporter, of course. It's so important to have a passion project." He made it sound like a quaint hobby, like macrame or stamp collecting. He never mentioned that my little blog on architectural history and urban design had a readership in the hundreds of thousands and had won multiple awards. He never mentioned that the income from it, which I deliberately downplayed, was more than enough to live on comfortably. In his narrative, I was the struggling artist, and he was the benevolent patron. "Don't you worry about the rent, darling," he'd say, patting my hand. "I've got it covered. Just focus on your art." The rent. I almost laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that was swallowed by the high ceilings. The rent for this 5,000 square foot palace in the sky, with its private elevator and 360-degree views. He paid it every month, a seamless transfer from his investment account to the building's management company. He saw it as the ultimate proof of his success, the tangible result of his high-stakes job as a venture capitalist. He loved to bring new people here, to watch their jaws drop as they stepped out of the elevator directly into the foyer. "Just a little something I picked up," he'd say with a self-deprecating shrug that was anything but. He never questioned the surprisingly reasonable rent, a figure I had personally set with my management team before I'd even met him. He never wondered why the notoriously difficult co-op board had approved his application with unprecedented speed. He never noticed that the building's name, the Seraphina, was the same as mine. He'd once commented on it, laughing. "What a coincidence, right? It was a sign. I was destined to have this place, and you were destined to be with me in it." He saw the world only as it reflected him. I was just another beautiful object he had acquired to perfect the image. My phone buzzed on the granite countertop in the kitchen. It was a message from my head of security, a man named Marcus who had been with my family for 20 years. "He's on his way to the gala, alone. Are you all right, Ms. Vance?" I typed back a simple reply. "I'm fine, Marcus. Thank you. Please initiate the sunset protocol." It was a contingency plan we had created years ago, a series of steps to be taken if my personal life and my professional identity were ever at risk of a hostile collision. It was designed for a corporate threat, a media leak, a security breach. I never imagined I would use it against the man I loved. But Julian had just declared war, and he had no idea his enemy owned the very ground on which he fought. The Sunset Protocol was a quiet, systematic reassertion of control. It began with a digital lockdown, securing my personal assets and communications. Then, it would move to the physical. Small changes, at first. A new Wi-Fi password. A keycard that suddenly stopped working in the residence gym. A reservation at the Peak building's exclusive rooftop restaurant that mysteriously disappears. It was a slow, creeping siege, designed to unravel the seamless, privileged life Julian took for granted. He thought he was the king of this castle. He was about to find out he was just a guest, and his checkout time had been moved up. I picked up my teacup, its warmth, a small comfort in the sudden chill of my new reality. He wanted me to have nothing without him. I was about to show him just how much I had on my own. The penthouse Julian considered the crown jewel of his existence was, in reality, little more than a beautifully appointed cage I had helped construct. My real office, my sanctuary, was 3 floors directly below it, accessible only by a private service elevator that required a biometric scan. It was a space no one, not even the building's primary architect, knew existed. I called it the Vault. While Julian's home was a sterile gallery of chrome, glass, and ostentatious displays of wealth, the Vault was a haven of warm woods, worn leather, and the comforting scent of old books and fresh coffee. One entire wall was a seamless bank of monitors, currently displaying architectural blueprints, stock market tickers, and live security feeds from a dozen properties across the country. This was the nerve center of Vance Holdings, the multi-billion-dollar real estate empire I had inherited from my father and had quietly quadrupled in size over the past decade. I sank into the deep leather chair behind my expansive desk, the one my father had used for 40 years. Its surface was scarred with the history of 1,000 deals, a map of a legacy I had fought to protect. From this chair, I had overseen the acquisition of historic landmarks, the development of sustainable urban communities, and the meticulous management of luxury properties like the one I now found myself in. I was Seraphina Vance, a name that appeared on Forbes lists and in the Wall Street Journal, a name synonymous with shrewd investment and architectural preservation. But for the past 3 years, I had also been just Seraphina, the quiet writer, the supportive girlfriend who listened with feigned interest as Julian explained the basics of market capitalization to me over dinner. I had created the role, slipped into it like a costume, all for the hope of finding something real. I wanted to be loved, or at least chosen, for who I was, not for what I owned. I wanted a partner who saw me, not a balance sheet. It was a romantic, naive experiment, and the results were now painfully, irrevocably in. My assistant, Clara, entered without knocking, placing a steaming mug on my desk. It was the same artisan teacup from upstairs. She kept a set for me in the vault's small kitchenette. Clara was in her late 60s, with a sharp bob of silver hair and an even sharper mind. She had been my father's executive assistant and had seamlessly transitioned to being my confidant, my strategist, and the fiercely loyal guardian of my double life. She was the only one who knew the full extent of my relationship with Julian. "The Sunset Protocol is active," she said, her voice calm and steady, a welcome anchor in my emotional storm. "Marcus has rerouted all building communications through this office. Julian's keycard has been downgraded from owner level to guest level. It will expire in exactly 1 week. His access to the building's amenities has been revoked, effective immediately. The concierge has been given the new directive. All packages and deliveries for Mr. Croft are to be held at the front desk, pending resident authorization. You are now the only authorized resident of Penthouse A." I nodded, tracing the rim of the teacup. "He thinks he's kicking me out, Clara." "The irony is not lost on me," she said dryly. "He's at the museum gala right now, probably telling anyone who will listen how he's finally cut ties with his charity case girlfriend." I took the liberty of checking the guest list. He's seated at a table with the CEO of a rival development firm. It seems he was planning to use his quote ownership of this building as leverage in a new business venture. Of course he was. Every part of his life was a transaction. I had been a transaction, a way for him to acquire the social currency of a beautiful, intelligent, and conveniently dependent partner. The penthouse was his biggest asset in the game of perception he played so masterfully. The story of how we met replayed in my mind. It was at a fundraiser for architectural preservation, one of my company's flagship charity events. I had attended anonymously as I always did, dressed down in simple, elegant clothes, content to observe from the sidelines. He had approached me not with a pickup line but with a critique of the building we were in. "They used the wrong materials for the restoration," he'd said, his eyes scanning the vaulted ceiling. "It's historically inaccurate. A real investor would have known that." He was confident, knowledgeable, and passionate. For the first time in years, I was talking to a man who seemed to share my interests, not just my tax bracket. I had let him believe I was just a freelance writer with a passion for old buildings. When he'd asked me out, I'd accepted. When he'd suggested we move in together into the spectacular penthouse in the new building called the Seraphina, I'd feigned surprise and wonder at the coincidence. I'd let him preen and posture, let him take the lead, all the while quietly pulling the strings in the background to make his life appear as effortless and successful as he so desperately wanted it to be. I had arranged for his application to be approved. I had set his rent. I had instructed the building staff to treat him with the deference due an owner. I had built him a kingdom on a foundation of lies, hoping he would eventually prove himself worthy of the truth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The truth was now laid bare. He wasn't just arrogant, he was cruel. He wasn't just confident, he was a user. He hadn't just underestimated me, he had actively sought to diminish me, to make me smaller so he could feel bigger. The condescending pats on the hand, the way he'd explain my own field of expertise to me, the way he'd dismiss my opinions with a chuckle and a, "That's cute, darling." It all clicked into place, not as individual slights, but as a calculated campaign of psychological warfare designed to erode my self-worth and increase my dependency on him. And the most painful part was that I had allowed it. I had been a willing participant in my own diminishment. "What do you want to do?" Clara asked, her voice softening. "Legally, we can have him removed by morning. A simple eviction notice. He's not on the lease. He has no legal standing. I shook my head. No, that's too fast. That's a clean break. He deserves to understand the full scope of his miscalculation. He built his entire identity around this apartment, this life of effortless luxury. I want him to watch it fall apart, piece by piece. I want him to feel the walls closing in, to question his own reality. He told me I had a week to get out. I'm going to give him the most confusing, frustrating, and powerless week of his life. A small, grim smile touched Clara's lips. I'll have the IT team start with the smart home system. I imagine Mr. Croft will be very surprised when his voice commands for party playlist suddenly start playing funeral dirges. I looked at the monitors, at the empire I commanded from the shadows. For 3 years I had hidden this part of myself, believing it was a barrier to love. I saw now that it was my strength, my power, my fortress. Julian had mistaken my silence for weakness, my quiet support for neediness. He had never bothered to look beyond the character I was playing. He was about to get a front-row seat to the performance of a lifetime, and the star of the show was the woman he thought he'd left with nothing. The curtain was rising on his downfall, and I, the architect of his silent, gilded world, was ready to bring the house down. The foundation of our relationship, I realized with the cold clarity of hindsight, was built on a blueprint of his own design, and I had willingly handed him the tools. Every memory, every shared moment, was now tainted by the knowledge of his deep-seated condescension. It wasn't a single act of betrayal, but a slow, creeping rot that had infested the core of our life together. The man I thought I was falling in love with, the one who could debate the merits of brutalist architecture and find beauty in decaying industrial sites, was merely the charming facade of a deeply insecure man. His passion wasn't for the buildings themselves, but for the status that being an expert on them conferred. I remembered our first anniversary. I had spent weeks planning a surprise trip for him. Using my private resources, I'd arranged a tour of several exclusive, historically significant homes in New England that were not open to the public. These were architectural marvels, places Julian had only read about in textbooks. It was a gift I thought would speak directly to his soul, a shared experience that would transcend the material world he was so obsessed with. I'd presented him with a simple, leather-bound itinerary over breakfast. He'd flipped through it, a small, tight smile on his face. "This is thoughtful, Seraphina," he'd said, the word thoughtful landing with the weight of a consolation prize. "But I've just landed the Miller account. It's a huge deal. I can't possibly get away right now. Besides," he'd added, pushing the itinerary back across the table, "a trip like this, it's a bit much for you to handle, isn't it? The logistics, the bookings, it can be overwhelming." He had then saved the day by canceling my meticulously planned trip and booking a weekend at a flashy, overpriced resort in Miami, a place he'd seen featured in a lifestyle magazine. "Don't worry, I'll take care of everything," he'd announced, as if bestowing a great favor. "We'll have a proper celebration." That weekend, he'd spent the entire time on his phone, taking selfies by the pool and posting them with hashtags like #PowerCouple and #LivingTheDream. He'd paraded me around as his beautiful, adoring girlfriend, the perfect accessory to his success. I had smiled, I had played my part, and I had swallowed the bitter pill of disappointment. I had told myself he was just stressed from work, that his focus on image was a necessary evil in his competitive field. I had lied to myself. The truth was, he couldn't stand the idea of me giving him something he couldn't have acquired himself. My gift, born of passion and connection, was a threat to his narrative of being the sole provider, the grand architect of our lives. His control extended to every corner of my life. He vetted my writing before I posted it, offering helpful suggestions that invariably stripped my articles of their unique voice and academic rigor, making them more palatable for a mainstream audience. He'd say, "You're too in the weeds, darling. People want to be entertained, not educated." He curated my wardrobe, replacing my comfortable, classic pieces with trendy designer labels that felt like costumes. "You have to look the part, Seraphina. You're a reflection of me. he'd remind me as he handed over his credit card. A card I now knew was funded, in part, by the generous allowance I had been anonymously depositing into his account each month, disguised as returns from a high-yield investment fund I had set up for him as a gift. He thought he was a financial genius, a self-made man. In reality, he was a kept man, and he was so blinded by his own ego he couldn't see it. The most insidious part of his deception was how he isolated me from my own world. In the early days, I had tried to introduce him to a few old friends, people who knew me before I was Seraphina Vance, real estate mogul. One was a history professor, another a museum curator. They were brilliant, funny, and unimpressed by material wealth. Julian had been polite but dismissive, steering the conversation back to his latest business deal, his new car, his portfolio. After they left, he'd sighed dramatically. "They're nice people, I suppose," he'd said, loosening his tie. "But a little provincial, don't you think? You need to surround yourself with people who are going places, Seraphina. Your network is your net worth." He had effectively vetoed my friends, and to maintain my cover, to avoid the difficult questions they might ask, I had let him. I had allowed my world to shrink until it fit inside the gilded cage of his penthouse. My phone buzzed again. It was Clara, forwarding a message from the concierge downstairs. "Mr. Croft is on the phone. He is irate. His keycard was just declined at the rooftop bar, and he is demanding to know why his reservation for 2 was cancelled. He is citing his, quote, owner privileges." A grim satisfaction settled over me. The first crack in his perfect world had appeared. He was being confronted with a power he didn't understand, a system that was no longer responding to his commands. He would assume it was a mistake, a glitch in the system. He would bluster and threaten, and when that failed, he would try to charm the staff. He had no idea that the concierge, the doorman, the entire building staff were all employees of Vance Holdings. Their loyalty was not to the temporary resident of the penthouse, but to the woman who signed their paychecks. I instructed Clara to have the concierge be polite but firm. Inform Mr. Croft that there has been an update to the building's resident policies. All amenities are now restricted to registered leaseholders. Apologize for the inconvenience. The phrase registered leaseholders was a carefully chosen stiletto. He wasn't one. He never had been. He was a guest, a long-term occupant in a suite owned by Seraphina Vance. This would be the first breadcrumb, the first hint that his understanding of his own life was fundamentally flawed. He wouldn't get it yet. His ego was a fortress, and it would take more than a declined keycard to breach its walls. But the siege had begun. I thought of him at that gala, his face flushed with anger and confusion, his perfect evening disrupted. He would be scrambling to regain control, to reassert the authority he believed was his birthright. He was trying to put out a small fire, unaware that I was about to unleash a flood. The blueprint of his deception was laid out before me, and I was now the one holding the pen, ready to redraft the entire structure, starting with the demolition of his carefully constructed world. Julian returned to the penthouse hours later, the sharp click of his Italian leather shoes on the marble foyer echoing his fury. I watched him on the discreetly placed security camera, one of a dozen feeds tiled on the main screen in the vault. His face, usually a mask of practiced, charming indifference, was tight with anger. He flung his keys, a heavy, pretentious fob for a car he leased but claimed to own, onto the glass console table with a clatter that made me wince. It was a rare break in his carefully controlled composure. The gala, his stage for debuting a newly single, powerful persona, had been tainted. The public denial of his owner privileges was a stain on his perfect image, a public questioning of his status that he could not tolerate. He immediately strode to the integrated control panel by the door, his movements stiff and jerky. I watched as his finger jabbed at the screen. From my vantage point, I could see the panel's display. He was trying to lodge a formal complaint with building management. A small spinning icon appeared on his screen, and then a message I had personally scripted with Clara an hour before. Error 404. Management portal not found. Please contact your registered leaseholder for assistance. Useless, he muttered, turning away from the panel in disgust. He pulled out his phone, his thumb flying across the screen. A moment later, a new window popped up on my own monitor. It was a transcript of a text message he was sending to a group chat he called The Boardroom, a collection of equally ambitious and image-obsessed men from his circle. Julian, you will not believe the incompetence at my building tonight. The staff needs a complete overhaul. Can't even get a drink at my own bar. One of his friends replied almost instantly. Mate, you should sell that place. The management sounds like a joke. Come over to my building, the Sterling. Service is impeccable. Julian's fingers paused over his phone. I could see the conflict in him. Admitting further problems would damage his brand, but his ego demanded vindication. He typed, deleted, and then finally wrote, Nah, just growing pains. I'll sort it out. The view is too good to give up. He was protecting the lie, even to his closest friends. The penthouse was his status symbol, and he couldn't bear to have it tarnished. He would blame the staff, the system, anything but the possibility that his own standing was not what he believed it to be. He then moved toward the living area and, with a deep sigh, said in a commanding voice, System, play my decompress playlist, volume at 60%. This was the moment Clara had been waiting for. On her own console, she rerouted his command. Instead of the smooth jazz and ambient electronic music Julian favored, the Minalef, state-of-the-art sound system, which was wired into every room, burst to life with the cacophonous, ear-splitting sounds of a German industrial metal band I knew he despised. The volume wasn't at 60%, it was at 100. The guttural screaming and frantic drumming filled the penthouse, the vibrations rattling the very glass of the coffee table. Julian physically recoiled, clapping his hands over his ears. System, stop! Stop music! He yelled over the din. But the system didn't respond. The music thundered on. He scrambled for the wall panel, his face a mask of panicked rage, and stabbed at the screen. The music abruptly cut out, plunging the room back into a ringing silence. He stood there, breathing heavily, his tailored suit looking rumpled for the first time since I'd known him. What the hell is wrong with this place? He seethed to the empty room. In the vault, Clara allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Phase 1 of the auditory annoyance protocol is complete, she stated, making a note on her tablet. Shall I proceed with the climate control variations? Give him an hour to cool down, I said, a strange mix of exhilaration and unease churning within me. Or rather, to heat up. I watched as Julian, visibly unnerved, poured himself a large glass of whiskey from the crystal decanter on the bar. He took a long swallow and began to pace, his phone back in his hand. This time he was calling the 24/7 tech support hotline for the smart home system, a number that now patched directly to a call center I had on retainer in a different time zone. The script I'd provided them was intricate. They were to be incredibly polite, endlessly apologetic, and utterly useless. They would walk him through a labyrinth of reboot sequences, password resets, and diagnostic tests that would lead nowhere, all while gathering data on his escalating frustration. I leaned back in my father's chair, the worn leather a comforting presence. This was more than just petty revenge. It was a deconstruction. Julian had built his life on the idea of seamless control. Everything had to be perfect, effortless, and a reflection of his power. He believed that with enough money and influence, the world would bend to his will. What he was now experiencing was the subtle, terrifying powerlessness that comes when the systems you rely on turn against you. He was a king discovering that his castle was haunted, that the very walls had turned traitor. My mind drifted back to a time, early in our relationship, when my own laptop had crashed. I had lost a chapter of a detailed article one was writing. I'd been distraught, not just at the lost work, but at the feeling of helplessness. Julian had found me, sighing with a mixture of pity and affection. "Oh, darling," he'd said, stroking my hair, "this is why you can't rely on these things. You're just not a tech person. Leave it to me." He had then spent an hour lecturing me on cloud storage and backup systems, treating me like a child who had failed to grasp a simple concept. He had eventually called his own IT guy from work to fix it. making a grand show of his ability to solve my problem. Now, the tables had turned. He was the one lost in a technological maze, and the architect of his frustration was the non-tech person he had so casually dismissed. He thought he was dealing with incompetent staff and faulty software. He had no idea he was battling a ghost he had created with every condescending remark, every dismissive gesture, every time he had looked at me and failed to see the woman who was truly there. The symphony of malfunction had only just begun, and I was its unseen conductor, waiting to see if he would break, or if he would finally, for the first time, start to question the flawed blueprint of his own reality. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in psychological erosion. Julian, a man who worshipped at the altar of routine and predictability, found himself living in a world governed by chaos. His mornings, once a precise ritual of temperature-controlled showers, automated blinds rising with the sun, and a pre-ordered coffee delivered to his door, became a series of minor tortures. On Tuesday morning, I watched him wake to an apartment chilled to a brisk 55 degrees. The climate control system, which he had tried and failed to reset the night before, had apparently developed a mind of its own. He shivered as he stepped onto the cold marble floor, wrapping his silk robe tightly around himself. "System, temperature to 72 degrees, he commanded, his voice hoarse. A pleasant female voice, one I had selected for its serene and slightly condescending tone, replied, "Of course," setting temperature to 54 degrees. He swore, a raw, guttural sound of pure frustration, and stalked to the control panel, only to find it unresponsive, displaying a cheerful message. "System maintenance in progress. We appreciate your patience." His sacred morning routine was in tatters. The smart shower, which was supposed to recognize him and adjust to his preferred pressure and temperature, doused him in ice-cold water. The automated blinds, timed to his alarm, remained stubbornly shut, plunging the cavernous apartment into a gloomy twilight. His coffee, which he had tried to order via the building's app, was met with a new notification. "Delivery services are reserved for residents on our Gold tier plan. Your current plan does not support this feature." Through the cameras, I saw him standing in the middle of his kitchen, a space usually filled with morning light, looking utterly lost. This wasn't just inconvenience, it was a fundamental disruption of his identity. Julian's sense of self was inextricably linked to his environment. The seamless functioning of his home was proof of his success, his power, his control. Now, the machine he thought he commanded was actively working against him, and he had no idea why. Clara sat across from me in the vault, reviewing a log of his increasingly frantic calls to the tech support hotline. "His paranoia is escalating," she observed, pointing to a transcript. "He's no longer just blaming incompetence. He's now suggesting corporate sabotage. He asked our agent if a rival firm could have hacked the building's network. He specifically named the CEO of Sterling Development, the man whose table he was at during the gala." "Perfect," I murmured. "Let him chase shadows. Let him believe he's a victim of his own success." It was exactly the narrative his ego would find most palatable. He couldn't be failing. He must be being attacked. That afternoon, he had a crucial video conference with potential investors in Singapore. It was a deal he had been boasting about for weeks, one he claimed would catapult the firm into the next decade. He set up his laptop on the massive dining table, the chaotic painting of the screaming face looming behind him. 10 minutes before the call, as if on cue, the building's internet connection in his unit began to throttle. His high-speed fiber optic line, capable of downloading a movie in seconds, slowed to the speed of dial-up from the 1990s. I watched, mesmerized, as his confident presentation devolved into a frantic ballet of technological failure. His video feed froze, his face a pixelated mask of horror. His audio cut in and out, turning his eloquent pitch into a garbled mess of digital static. "Can hear me?" he'd ask, his voice tinny and distant. "The connection seems unstable." On the other end, the investors' faces shifted from interest to impatience, then to polite dismissal. The call ended abruptly. Julian slammed his laptop shut with such force that I worried the screen would crack. "Pa!" He didn't yell, he didn't pace, he just sat there in the silence, staring at the dead screen. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something beyond anger in his eyes. It was fear. A primal fear of irrelevance. His power, his influence, his entire curated identity, it was all predicated on a flawless performance. And his stage was collapsing around him. A wave of something complex and uncomfortable washed over me. This wasn't just satisfying, it was also profoundly sad. I had once loved a version of this man. I had held out hope that beneath the layers of arrogance and insecurity, there was a person worth fighting for. Watching his controlled world crumble felt less like a victory and more like a necessary autopsy on a relationship that had been dead for a long time. "Are you having second thoughts, Seraphina?" Clara asked gently, her perception as sharp as ever. I shook my head, though the gesture felt uncertain. "No, I'm not." This is confirmation. Confirmation that the foundation was always rotten. I just provided the earthquake. I looked at the screen, at the man sitting alone in the dark. "He's feeling haunted, Clara. He feels like there's a ghost in his machine." "Perhaps there is," she replied softly, "the ghost of the woman he refused to see." The thought resonated deep within me. I wasn't just a hidden operator pulling levers from below. I was a presence in that apartment, my will seeping through the wires and the climate ducts. Every malfunction was an echo of a time he had dismissed me. The cold air was the chill of his condescension. The blaring music was the scream I had swallowed every time he patronized me. The faulty internet was the broken connection between the person I was and the person he wanted me to be. That night, Julian didn't even try to use the smart home features. He ate a cold sandwich for dinner and sat in the near dark, nursing a whiskey. Before he went to bed, I initiated the next phase. While he slept, a maintenance worker, one of Marcus's most trusted men, let himself into the penthouse. He didn't take anything. He just moved things. A single book from a shelf to a table. A framed photo on his nightstand turned a few degrees to the left, and on the bathroom counter, next to his expensive cologne, he placed a single, simple artisan teacup. An object that didn't belong. A quiet, undeniable message that someone else had been there. The ghost was no longer just in the machine. It was now in the room. The teacup was a declaration of war fought on a new front. Technology could be faulty, systems could be hacked, but a physical object, placed with quiet deliberation in the heart of his private sanctuary, was an entirely different kind of violation. It was intimate, it was personal, and it was terrifying. Cheeky Hibble, I watched him discover it the next morning. He stumbled into the vast, marble-clad bathroom, his face pale and drawn from a restless night. He splashed water on his face, avoiding his own reflection in the mirror, as if he no longer recognized the man looking back. Then he reached for his cologne, and his hand froze. He saw it. The teacup. It sat there on the gleaming counter. A small, unassuming piece of pottery. Its hand-painted imperfections, a stark contrast to the sterile, mass-produced luxury surrounding it. It was mine. He knew it instantly. It was the cup he'd always despised, the one he'd called clutter. His reaction was not explosive. It was something far more unnerving. He didn't touch it. He circled it, like a wary animal encountering a trap. He looked at the door, which was locked from the inside. He checked the windows, which were sealed. He scanned the room, his eyes darting into every corner, searching for an explanation that didn't exist. The cold logic of his world, a world of locked doors and impenetrable security, was failing him. A teacup had materialized out of thin air. He slowly backed out of the bathroom, his gaze fixed on the object as if it were a venomous snake. He pulled on his clothes with frantic, jerky movements, his mind clearly racing. Who? How? The questions must have been screaming in his head. The staff? An enemy? Me? He would dismiss the last possibility almost immediately. In his mind, I was the one who had been cast out. I was the one with nothing. The idea that I could orchestrate something so intricate, so invasive, was beyond his comprehension. To him, I was the damsel in distress, not the architect of his psychological torment. His paranoia, which had been simmering for days, now boiled over. He no longer trusted the space. He began searching the apartment, his movements clumsy and desperate. He looked under the sofa cushions, behind the curtains, in the closets. He was looking for a sign of intrusion, a bug, a hidden camera, anything to prove that his world was being actively targeted. The irony was suffocating. He was frantically searching for the surveillance systems that he was, at that very moment, performing for. He spent 2 hours on the phone, not with tech support this time, but with a private security firm he had on retainer. I listened in from the vault as he tried to explain the situation, his voice a strained whisper. My apartment has been compromised. I need a full sweep. Immediately. Bugs, surveillance, the works. Of course, Mr. Croft, the security consultant on the other end replied. We can have a team there this afternoon. We'll just need to coordinate access with your building's head of security. Fine, just do it, Julian snapped. This was a move I had anticipated. The building's head of security was Marcus, my Marcus. Clara sent him a concise message. Mr. Croft is attempting to bring in an outside security firm. Stall them. He is not authorized to approve a third-party sweep of a Vance Holdings property. The ensuing bureaucratic nightmare for Julian was a thing of beauty. His high-priced security firm was met with a wall of corporate red tape. There were forms to be filled out, liability waivers to be signed, and background checks to be run, all of which, Marcus explained regretfully over the phone to Julian, could take anywhere from 5 to 10 business days to process. 10 business days? Julian roared into his phone, his voice echoing in the penthouse. This is a priority. I am the owner of this unit. I understand your frustration, sir, Marcus replied, his tone a perfect blend of empathy and helplessness. But our protocols are very strict. They are set by the building's ownership group, Vance Holdings, and I have no authority to override them. For the security of all our residents, we simply cannot allow an unsanctioned external team to access the building's infrastructure. The mention of Vance Holdings was another breadcrumb, a name he would have heard but paid little attention to, assuming it was just another faceless corporation. He was a fish, thrashing in a net, completely unaware of the fisherman holding the line. Defeated, he hung up the phone. He was trapped. He couldn't trust his home, and he was powerless to secure it. He was a prisoner in his own palace, haunted by a ghost who drank from a teacup. He picked up the cup finally, his fingers trembling slightly. He didn't throw it, he didn't smash it. He walked to the trash chute in the hallway and dropped it in, the sound of its disappearance a small, unsatisfying thud. He thought he had disposed of the problem. But when he returned to the apartment and walked into his bedroom, he found an identical teacup sitting on his pillow. The second teacup broke him. It was a checkmate move in a game he didn't know he was playing. The first cup could have been a mistake, a bizarre prank. The second was a statement. It was a demonstration of absolute power, of an ability to bypass every lock, every system, every semblance of security he possessed. It said, I can go anywhere. I can do anything. You are not safe. I watched on the monitor as Julian stared at the teacup on his pillow. All the fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a hollow, vacant look. He sank onto the edge of his bed, his head in his hands. He stayed that way for nearly an hour, motionless. The man who orchestrated multi-million-dollar deals, who commanded boardrooms with his unshakable confidence, was defeated by a piece of pottery. His next actions were not those of a powerful executive, but of a man unraveling. He began to talk to himself, pacing the length of the apartment in a frantic, agitated loop. It's not real, he'd mutter. It's a trick, a psychological game. He'd stop and listen, tilting his head as if trying to catch a sound that wasn't there. Is someone there? I know you're there. This gave Clara an idea. It's time for the auditory hallucinations, she said, her fingers flying across her keyboard. Using the highly directional speakers embedded in the walls, she began to play sounds at a barely perceptible volume. A soft whisper, too faint to be understood. The sound of a page turning in an empty room. a floorboard creaking overhead. They were small, insignificant sounds, but for a mind already primed for paranoia, they were gasoline on a fire. Julian would freeze mid-stride, his body tensing. "What was that?" he'd whisper. He'd press his ear to the wall, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and rage. He was becoming a ghost hunter in his own home, chasing phantom noises that I was feeding directly into his crumbling psyche. The walls themselves had become his enemy. His attempts to regain control grew more pathetic. He tried to change the locks on his front door himself, ordering a high-security deadbolt online. The package arrived, but the concierge, following protocol, refused to release it to him. "I'm sorry, Mr. Croft, but all architectural modifications, including lock changes, must be approved by the board and installed by the building's licensed and bonded maintenance team." Another dead end. He was reduced to dragging a heavy armchair in front of his door before he went to sleep, a primitive barricade in a billion-dollar fortress. Desperate, he tried to reassert his dominance in the one area he still felt he controlled. His image. He had a date that night. A model he'd been seeing casually, the woman who was supposed to be my replacement. He had likely told her he owned the building, and he needed to perform that role for her, to prove to himself that he was still the man he pretended to be. It was a foolish, desperate gambit. Tess. As he was getting ready, I initiated the final phase of the Sunset Protocol. His date arrived downstairs, and the doorman politely informed her that Mr. Croft was not accepting visitors. When she called Julian, confused, he flew into a rage. I listened as he screamed at the concierge over the intercom, who calmly explained, "Sir, your guest privileges were suspended due to a pending review of your residency status. I have no record of you on the permanent residence list." "What are you talking about? I am the resident," he bellowed. "My list says the sole registered leaseholder for Penthouse A is a Ms. Seraphina Vance," the concierge replied, his voice a death knell of polite, professional calm. "Would you like me to try and contact her for you?" Silence. A profound, absolute silence on the other end of the line. The name had been spoken. The final breadcrumb had been laid, leading not to some corporate entity but directly to me. I watched his face on the camera. The anger, the fear, the confusion, it all coalesced into a single, dawning horror. It was the look of a man whose entire reality had just been torn down to the studs. He finally understood that the ghost in his machine, the whispers in his walls, the power turning his life inside out. It wasn't a rival or a hacker, it was me. The quiet writer, the charity case girlfriend, the woman he thought he'd left with nothing. He stumbled backward, away from the intercom, and sank onto the floor, the truth hitting him with the force of a physical blow. The game was over. All that was left was the reckoning. Taprid to fail amins trarkin sound. The name hit him with the force of a physical impact. Seraphina Vance. It wasn't just a name. It was a key, unlocking 100 sealed rooms in his memory. And behind every door was a scene of his own breathtaking foolishness. The world didn't just tilt on its axis. It inverted, leaving him dangling over a chasm of his own ignorance. He scrambled away from the intercom as if it were radioactive, his back hitting the cold, unyielding wall. He slid down to the floor, his expensive suit crumpling around him. On the security monitor in the vault, I saw his face, stripped bare of its usual arrogance. It was the face of a man who had just seen a ghost, not of the dead, but of the living. A ghost who had been sleeping next to him for 3 years. Seraphina Vance. The name echoed, a relentless ricochet in the cavern of his skull. Vance Holdings, the blue-chip real estate titan. The company whose new developments were the gold standard of the industry. The firm he had tried and failed to get a meeting with last year. He remembered complaining about it to me, ranting about their impenetrable corporate structure. "It's like the CEO is a myth," he'd fumed. I had listened, nodding sympathetically, and offered to make him a cup of tea. The memories now returned, not as fond recollections, but as exhibits in the trial of his own idiocy. That first fundraiser for architectural preservation. It was a Vance Holdings event. Her name, Seraphina Vance must have been on the patrons list, on the invitation, somewhere. But he had only seen a beautiful, unassuming woman in a simple dress who seemed impressed by his knowledge. He hadn't bothered to look closer. The penthouse. The Seraphina. He had laughed at the coincidence, preened at what he called destiny. It wasn't destiny. It was branding. He was living in a flagship property named after the woman he was sharing a bed with. He had treated her as a guest in her own home, a home that was a monument to her family's legacy. That property, the surprisingly low rent, the effortless approval from the co-op board, the deferential treatment from the staff who, he now realized, were all her employees. They hadn't been respecting him. They had been following the orders of their real boss. His allowance, the high-yield investment fund he boasted about to his friends, the one that provided a steady, generous income stream, buffering his own commission-based salary. It had been set up by, quote, a boutique firm. He pulled out his phone, his hands shaking so violently he could barely unlock it. He scrolled through his financial apps, his blood turning to ice. The fund was managed by a subsidiary of Vance Holdings. He wasn't a financial genius. He was on a stipend. My stipend. Every condescending comment, every patronizing smile, every lecture on business and finance he had ever delivered to me replayed in his mind, now layered with a new soundtrack of his own echoing stupidity. He had explained real estate trends to the woman who dictated them. He had offered career advice to the woman who could buy and sell his entire firm with her pocket money. He had told her she had nothing without him, while he in fact had nothing without her. He was a fraud, a kept man wrapped in a Tom Ford suit, and the only person he had successfully fooled was himself. The rage and fear that had been his companions for days curdled into a thick, choking shame. He wasn't just outmatched, he was insignificant. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over my contact photo, a smiling, relaxed picture he had taken of me on a beach, a picture of the woman he thought he knew. He pressed the call button. He needed to hear my voice, to scream, to demand, to understand. Ras. The call didn't ring. A cool, automated voice, the same one from the climate control system, spoke in his ear. The number you have dialed is no longer in service for this caller. Goodbye. I had blocked him. Not just from my life, but from the very network that connected the world. It was the final, crushing demonstration of my power, and his absolute lack of it. He hurled his phone across the room, and this time, when it hit the far wall and shattered, the sound wasn't one of anger. It was the sound of a complete and total surrender. Julian spent the night adrift in the vast, silent penthouse. He didn't sleep. He wandered from room to room, a tourist in the ruins of his own life. The luxurious furniture, the priceless art, the panoramic views of the city, they were no longer symbols of his success, but monuments to his humiliation. Every object seemed to mock him, whispering the name he now understood to be the source of his entire existence. Vance. He expected a call, a text, a furious confrontation. He braced himself for my anger, my tears, my recriminations. It was a scene he could understand, a drama he knew how to navigate. What he received the next morning was far worse. It was silence, followed by a quiet, formal efficiency that was more terrifying than any emotional outburst. At precisely 9 a.m., the doorbell chimed. Not the electronic tone of the intercom, but the sound of a physical bell. He opened the door to find two people standing in the hallway. One was Marcus, the impassive head of security. The other was a woman he had never seen, dressed in a severe but elegant gray suit, her silver hair cut in a sharp, no-nonsense bob. It was Clara. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes held the cold, clear light of absolute authority. "Julian Croft?" she asked, though it wasn't a question. He nodded dumbly. "I am Clara Bell, Executive Administrator for the Office of Seraphina Vance," she said, her voice crisp and cool. She handed him a thick, cream-colored envelope. His name was written on the front in elegant, embossed script. "This is for you." His hands trembled as he took it. It felt heavy, final. He opened the unsealed flap and pulled out a single sheet of heavy cardstock. The letterhead read simply, Vance Holdings. The text was brief and brutal. To Mr. Julian Croft. From the office of Seraphina Vance. Date, July 1st, 2025. RE. Termination of guest occupancy at Penthouse A, the Seraphina. This letter serves as formal notification that your temporary guest occupancy of the aforementioned property is terminated, effective immediately. You are required to vacate the premises with all personal belongings within 24 hours. The deadline for your departure is 9 a.m. July 2nd, 2025. A professional inventory team will be on site at 10 a.m. today to begin cataloging the property's assets. We ask for your cooperation during this process. Furthermore, please be advised that a full financial review is being conducted regarding the investment portfolio, Ref. VH77B, established on your behalf by a Vance Holdings subsidiary. All associated accounts have been frozen pending the results of this audit, which will review the schedule of disbursements against the terms of your residency agreement. Any discrepancies will be addressed by our legal team. All further communications should be directed to this office. He read it twice, the words blurring together. Guest occupancy, frozen accounts, residency agreement, legal team. This wasn't a breakup, it was a corporate dissolution. He was being fired from the life he thought he had built. The letter stripped him of everything, not just his home and his money, but his dignity, reframing his entire 3-year relationship as a formal arrangement with terms and conditions he had now violated. He looked up from the letter, his face ashen. He looked at Clara, searching for some flicker of human emotion, some crack in her professional facade. He found none. A team will be up in 1 hour to begin the inventory, she stated, her gaze unwavering. We suggest you begin packing your personal effects. She turned to leave, her movements economical and precise. Wait, Julian croaked, his voice barely a whisper. Can I talk to her? Clara paused at the door, turning back to him. Her expression didn't soften, but her eyes held a spark of what might have been pity, or perhaps just contempt. Mr. Croft, she said, and for the first time her voice held a hint of inflection. Miss Vance has nothing more to say to you. You have been living in her world for 3 years. She has simply decided that your presence is no longer required. The hour that followed was the longest of Julian's life. He moved through the penthouse like a sleepwalker, his mind a fog of shame and disbelief. Packing. The letter had instructed him to pack his personal effects. The phrase, so simple and clinical, became an indictment. What, in this vast, opulent space, was truly his? He opened the doors to his walk-in closet, a room larger than most city apartments. It was a cathedral of consumerism, lined with rows of bespoke suits, Italian shoes and Swiss watches nestled in velvet-lined drawers. He reached for a cashmere coat, a piece he had worn to a winter gala, feeling its impossible softness. He'd bought it on a whim, swiping his credit card without a thought. But the money on that card, the limitless credit, it wasn't his. It was an extension of her wealth, a resource she had provided. Was the coat his? Or was it just part of the costume she had funded? He pulled out a suitcase, a sleek aluminum piece he'd been so proud of. As he opened it, he began to understand the true, pathetic scale of his assets. The suits, the shoes, the watches, they were all tied to the lie. They were props for the character of Julian Croft, the self-made tycoon. The real Julian Croft owned a few changes of clothes from before he met her, a worn copy of a book on investment strategy, and a collection of family photos on a phone that no longer worked. He packed with a sense of detachment, throwing items into the suitcase almost at random. Every object he touched accused him. The cufflinks a colleague had admired, a gift from me, the expensive art books on the nightstand, I had ordered them. The very bed he slept in, the sheets he lay on, all of it belonged to the apartment, to the building, to her. His life had been a rental, and he hadn't even known he was the tenant. Punctually at 10 a.m., the doorbell chimed again. Clara entered, followed by a team of 3 people in matching navy blue polo shirts embroidered with the Vance Holdings logo. They carried tablets and discreet scanning devices. They didn't look at Julian. They moved with a quiet, unnerving efficiency, fanning out into the apartment. One started in the kitchen, scanning the serial number on the Sub-Zero refrigerator. Another began documenting the artwork in the living room, cross-referencing it with a catalog on their tablet. Julian stood frozen in the middle of the room, a ghost in his own home. The inventory team moved around him as if he were a piece of furniture they were meant to ignore. Their impersonal professionalism was more demeaning than any overt hostility. He was irrelevant to the process of his own erasure. Clara stood near the entrance, her tablet in hand, observing. She wasn't gloating. Her expression was one of bland neutrality, the look of a manager overseeing a routine task. Julian finally found his voice, a raw, desperate croak. "You can't do this," he said, gesturing vaguely at the team scanning his belongings. "This is my home." Clara looked up from her tablet, her gaze meeting his for the first time since she'd handed him the letter. "On the contrary, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice even and cool. "We are reclaiming our property. Your presence here was a liability we are now mitigating." The word liability struck him like a slap. He had spent his entire life trying to be an asset. He had curated his image, his relationships, his very personality to project value. To be dismissed as a liability was to have his entire existence nullified. He retreated to the bedroom and hastily finished packing, his hands fumbling with the latches on his suitcase. He packed only the things he knew, with absolute certainty, were his before he had met me. The suitcase was half empty. When he emerged, the inventory team was finishing up. One of them was placing a small, serialized sticker on the base of a lamp. Tagged. Inventoried. Hers. He walked toward the door, dragging his single suitcase behind him. The team parted to let him pass, their faces impassive. As he reached the foyer, Clara looked up from her tablet one last time. She glanced at his meager luggage, the sum total of his authentic life. "Will that be all, Mr. Croft?" she asked. The simple question was devastating in its implication. It was a final, quiet confirmation of what he now knew to be true. He had contributed nothing. He had built nothing. He had brought nothing. And he would leave with nothing. He didn't answer. He just pulled his suitcase through the open door and stepped out of the life that was never his. The heavy oak door of the penthouse closed behind Julian with a soft, final click. The sound echoed the closing of a chapter, the shutting of a world. He stood in the private elevator lobby, a space that had once made him feel like a king, now feeling like the antechamber to his own execution. He pressed the button, and the elevator began its smooth, silent descent. With every floor he passed, he felt as though he were shedding a layer of the false identity he had worn for 3 years. When the doors opened into the main lobby, the change was palpable. The doorman, a man named George, who had always greeted him with a warm, "Good morning, Mr. Croft," now stood at his post, his gaze fixed on a point just over Julian's shoulder. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of dismissal, not of greeting. Julian was no longer a resident to be fawned over. He was just a man with a suitcase, a non-entity passing through. The whispers of the walls had become the silence of the staff. He pushed through the revolving glass doors and stepped onto the curb, the city's cacophony, a jarring assault after the engineered peace of the building. He pulled out his new, shattered phone and fumbled to open the ride-sharing app. He needed to get away, to find somewhere to think, to hide. He booked a car to a downtown hotel, a place where he could be anonymous. A notification popped up on his screen. Payment method declined. He stared at it, confused. He tried a different card. Declined. A third. Declined. A cold dread, sharper and more immediate than the existential shame he'd been feeling, washed over him. He opened his mobile banking app. His checking account, his savings, his investment portfolio, every account was emblazoned with the same stark red banner. Account frozen. Pending financial review. The letter. The audit. It wasn't a threat. It was a reality that had already been executed. She had cut him off completely. He was standing on a street corner, in one of the most expensive cities in the world, with a suitcase full of clothes and not a single dollar to his name. The humiliation was absolute and public, Carol Tarl. Panic set in. He was stranded. He scrolled through his contacts, his mind racing. Who could he call? Who could he ask for help without revealing the full, insane, emasculating truth of his situation? He landed on the name of a friend from his boardroom chat, a man named Rick whose father owned a shipping company. Rick valued status and success above all else. This would be the most difficult call of his life. He borrowed the doorman's phone, a further humiliation, and dialed. "Rick, it's Julian," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Jules, what's up, man? Calling from a weird number. Everything good?" "Yeah, listen, I'm in a bit of a jam," Julian began, choosing his words carefully. "There's been a hostile situation with the ownership of my building. A corporate raid, basically. They've frozen my assets temporarily as a power play. Long story. Point is, I'm stuck downtown. Could you possibly give me a ride?" There was a pause on the other end. Rick was no fool. "A hostile raid on your apartment building? What are you talking about? I thought you owned your place." "It's complicated," Julian hedged. "It's tied up with one of my ventures. Listen, can you just help me out? I need to get to the Four Seasons." Another pause, this one longer. Julian could almost hear the calculations whirring in Rick's head. "All right," Rick finally said, his tone now cooler, more distant. "I'll be there in 20. Black Mercedes." The click of the phone ending the call felt like a judgment. The warmth was gone, replaced by transactional obligation. Julian had just become a liability in his social circle, a project, a story to be told at the country club later. 20 minutes later, the black Mercedes pulled up. Rick didn't get out. He just leaned over and pushed the passenger door open. Julian threw his suitcase in the back and slid into the leather seat, the shame burning on his face. "So," Rick said, pulling away from the curb, not even trying to hide his morbid curiosity. "What the hell really happened, man? And who's Seraphina Vance?" Julian turned his head to look out the window, unable to meet his friend's gaze. The gleaming, magnificent tower of the Seraphina dominated the skyline. His monument. His folly. He watched it recede as they drove away, a shining beacon of a life he had stolen, and a world that had now, with methodical precision, utterly ejected him. He had no answer for Rick. He had no answers for anyone. He was just a man in someone else's car, with a half-empty suitcase, driving away from the woman who had given him everything and had just taken it all back. 3 days passed. For Julian, they were a disorienting purgatory. He was adrift in the guest room of Rick's sterile high-rise, a charity case living on borrowed time and pity. His frantic calls to his bank were met with the same impenetrable wall. His accounts were under a legal and financial review by Vance Holdings, and no information could be released. His social circle, once a source of strength and validation, had become a minefield of whispers and awkward silences. The story was leaking out, twisted into various sensational forms. Some said he'd been embezzling, others that he was a victim of a corporate takeover. But the most damaging version, the one that clung to him like the scent of smoke, was the most unbelievable and therefore the most repeated. Julian Croft had been nothing more than the kept man of a powerful woman who had finally tired of her pet project. He was a pariah, his meticulously crafted brand destroyed. The calls for business advice stopped, the invitations to exclusive events dried up. He was a ghost long before he was gone. It was in this state of complete freefall that the summons arrived. A courier delivered a simple, cream-colored envelope. Inside, a single card read, "Mr. Croft, Ms. Vance will grant you a 15-minute meeting today at 4 p.m. to conclude your affairs. A car will be sent to your current location. Punctuality is expected." Mappily Ann's, it was not a request, it was a command. He knew that refusing was not an option. This was his only chance to understand, to plead, to salvage some shred of dignity from the wreckage. At 3:30 p.m., a black town car, devoid of any ride-sharing logos, pulled up outside Rick's building. The driver was Marcus. He didn't speak as Julian slid into the back seat, just nodded once before pulling into traffic. The journey was silent and heavy with unspoken meaning. They didn't drive toward the familiar grand entrance of the Seraphina. Instead, They navigated to the rear of the building, descending into a subterranean service entrance Julian never knew existed. They passed through 3 separate security checkpoints, each requiring Marcus's handprint and a vocal authorization. The polished marble and soft lighting of the lobby were replaced by stark white walls, polished concrete floors, and the low hum of industrial machinery. This was the building's engine room, its central nervous system. Julian was being taken behind the curtain, into the mechanics of the world he had only ever experienced as a seamless illusion. Marcus led him to a heavy, unmarked steel door and opened it with another biometric scan. "Ms. Vance will see you now," he said, his voice flat. "You have 15 minutes." Julian stepped inside and the door hissed shut behind him. He was in the vault. The room was breathtaking, not for its opulence but for its raw, unpretentious power. The wall of monitors displaying blueprints and market data, the scent of old leather and paper, the massive, scarred wooden desk. It was the antithesis of the penthouse. The penthouse was a stage. This was a command center. And there she was, Seraphina. She wasn't standing in a power suit. She was dressed simply, in tailored trousers and a cashmere sweater, her hair pulled back. She wasn't looking at the monitors. She was looking directly at him. There was no anger in her eyes, no hatred, no glee. There was only a calm, profound, and devastating clarity. "Julian," she said, her voice even. "Thank you for coming." He swallowed, his throat dry. "Seraphina, I don't know what to say." "Don't say you're sorry," she replied, holding up a hand to stop him. "Your apologies are for the consequences you're facing, not for your actions." "I didn't bring you here for an apology. I brought you here for a debriefing." She gestured to the chair opposite her desk. He sat. On the polished surface of the desk between them was a single sheet of paper. It was a ledger. It listed, in neat typed columns, the monthly rent for the penthouse, subsidized. The funds dispersed from the investment account, a gift. The cost of the cars, the clothes, the vacations. At the bottom was a grand total, the complete cost of the life he had pretended was his own. "I wanted you to see the real blueprint of our relationship," she said quietly. "The one I drew, and you never bothered to read. You saw a woman you could mold, a project you could improve, a quiet backdrop for your brilliant life. You never once stopped to ask who I was, what I did, what I thought. You lectured me on my own industry, Julian. You dismissed my opinions on architectural history. You told me on more than one occasion that I would have nothing without you." A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "The irony is almost too perfect." "Why?" he finally choked out, the only question that mattered. "Why would you do all this? Why the elaborate lie?" This was the moment. The culmination of everything. "It wasn't a lie, Julian. It was an experiment," she said, her voice softening slightly, not with pity, but with the dispassion of a scientist discussing her findings. "I was tired of men who saw my name before they saw my face. I was tired of being valued for my net worth. When I met you, you seemed different. You were passionate, knowledgeable. I hoped that you might be the one to see me through the quiet, not just the quiet. I created a control for my experiment. I presented myself as someone without power, without wealth, to see if you could love me for myself." She leaned forward, her gaze pinning him to his chair. "And you failed, spectacularly. You didn't just fail to see me. You actively tried to diminish me. You needed me to be small so you could feel big. Your love wasn't for a person, it was for a power dynamic that made you feel secure." She leaned back, the verdict delivered. "The experiment is over. So what now?" he whispered. "You're going to ruin me?" "Don't be so dramatic," she said, a flash of the old irritation showing through. "You have already ruined yourself. I am simply concluding our business. I will not be pressing legal charges for the funds you accepted under false pretenses. The amount, while significant to you, is irrelevant to me. My legal team has drafted a non-disclosure agreement. It is comprehensive. You will sign it, and in return, a small, final sum will be released to you, enough for a first-class ticket to wherever you decide to reinvent yourself next. Think of it as severance pay. Her mercy was the final, most devastating blow. She wasn't destroying him, she was dismissing him. He was a failed project being archived, a minor liability being written off. Marcus entered the room without knocking. "Time is up, Ms. Vance. Sign the papers, Julian," Seraphina said, her tone once again all business. "And then go. Live whatever life you can cobble together from the truth." He signed, his hand unsteady. He didn't look at her again as Marcus escorted him out of the vault, out of the building's hidden depths and back into the harsh light of the real world. After he was gone, Seraphina stood up and walked to the large window of the vault. It didn't overlook the city skyline. It overlooked the building's massive, intricate foundation. She had spent 3 years looking up at a penthouse, pretending to be someone else. Now she was looking down at the core, at the strength that had been there all along. The exhausting performance was over. She had integrated her two halves, not by choice but by necessity. And in the wreckage of her failed experiment, she had found something invaluable. The freedom to be, completely and unapologetically, herself. She turned away from the foundation and toward the wall of monitors displaying her empire. The city awaited, her work awaited, her real life awaited. In the rarefied air of the city's elite, scandal travels faster than light. Julian's disappearance from the social firmament was as sudden and spectacular as a supernova. One day he was at the center of every conversation, the next he was a black hole, his absence pulling all speculation toward it. His desperate, face-saving narrative of a hostile corporate raid held for less than a day. The story was too vague, too dramatic, and it didn't align with the known facts. Vance Holdings was a private behemoth. It didn't do hostile raids on its own properties. Rick, the friend who had given Julian his ride into exile, was the primary vector of the truth. Over whiskey at a members-only club, trying to process the sheer strangeness of the situation, he recounted the story of Julian's frantic call and his subsequent eviction. He didn't have all the details, but he had the most crucial one. The building was called the Seraphina, and the girlfriend's name was Seraphina Vance. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots. The story spread like wildfire, mutating with each telling but always retaining its core, humiliating truth. Julian Croft, the man who had built his brand on an image of supreme control and self-made success, was a fraud. He hadn't just been dumped, he had been dismantled. The reaction was not one of sympathy. In a world built on power and perception, to be revealed as powerless was the ultimate sin. His former friends and colleagues distanced themselves from him with ruthless efficiency. He was no longer a peer. He was a cautionary tale, a punchline. His calls went unanswered. His name was quietly dropped from guest lists. The social and professional doors he had worked so hard to open, the ones he had condescendingly claimed to be holding open for me, slammed shut in his face. He had built his kingdom on the sands of a lie, and the tide had come in. While Julian's world imploded, I began the quiet, deliberate process of my own reemergence. For years, Seraphina Vance had been a name on a page, a mysterious figure who operated from the shadows. That had been a necessity born of a desire for privacy. But my experience with Julian had taught me that hiding, even for the best reasons, comes at a cost. It allows others to write your narrative for you. 2 weeks after Julian's departure, Vance Holdings announced its new philanthropic arm, the Vance Foundation for Architectural Integrity and Female Leadership. Its inaugural event was a gala, held not in some rented ballroom, but in the soaring, magnificent atrium of the Seraphina. This time, I did not attend as an anonymous observer. I was the host. When I stepped up to the podium, a hush fell over the room. It was filled with the city's most powerful figures, many of whom had known Julian, many of whom were now staring at me with a mixture of awe, curiosity, and a healthy dose of fear. They were seeing me for the first time, not the quiet girlfriend, but the woman who owned the ground they stood on. I didn't mention Julian, I didn't allude to the drama. I spoke about my father's legacy, about the responsibility of building cities with conscience, and about the critical need to dismantle the barriers that prevent talented women from reaching the highest echelons of business. I spoke with a passion and authority that I had, for 3 years, kept carefully under wraps. The speech was a statement. It was the public declaration of my undivided self. The ripple effect was immediate. The narrative shifted. The story was no longer about Julian's spectacular fall. It was about Seraphina Vance's brilliant, calculated rise. They had thought he was the sun, and I was a minor planet caught in his orbit. They now understood that I was, and always had been, the star at the center of the solar system. The quiet, unassuming woman was gone. In her place stood the CEO, the philanthropist, the architect of her own life, and she was just getting started. 6 months passed, turning the sharp edges of memory into the smooth stone of experience. The woman who had conducted a secret experiment on her own heart was gone, replaced by one who lived with radical transparency. The energy I had once expended on maintaining 2 separate identities was now channeled into my work and my foundation, with explosive results. The Vance Foundation became a force in the city. We launched a mentorship program that paired aspiring female architects with industry leaders. We provided seed funding for women-led construction and development startups, businesses that had been historically overlooked by venture capital firms like the one where Julian had worked. Every success story, every building that broke ground, every woman who shattered a glass ceiling with our support, felt like a reclamation of the power I had once hidden away. It was no longer enough to own the buildings. I wanted to change the way they were built and who got to build them. My personal life had also found a new, healthier equilibrium. I had reconnected with my old provincial friends, the professor and the curator. Our evenings were filled with laughter and debate, conversations that nourished my intellect rather than starved it. They had known me as Seraphina all along, and the addition of Vance changed nothing between us. It was a profound relief. I had even started dating again, cautiously at first, then with a growing sense of confidence. On my first date with a kind, intelligent history professor, he asked me what I did for a living before I could even take a sip of my wine. "I run a real estate development and investment firm," I said simply, without apology or embellishment. He smiled. "Vance Holdings? I'm a great admirer of your company's preservation work on the old city library. That must be incredibly rewarding." The conversation flowed from there, easy and natural. He wasn't intimidated by my success, nor was he overly impressed. He was interested in me, the person who did the work. It was everything I had once hoped for from Julian, and it had come to me only when I had stopped hiding. One rainy afternoon, while reviewing a market analysis report in the vault, I saw a small, insignificant news item from a Phoenix business journal. A small renewable energy startup had secured a modest round of funding. I scanned the list of employees mentioned in the article. There, near the bottom, was his name, Julian Croft, Junior Project Manager. A picture accompanied the article. He looked different. The arrogant swagger was gone. He was thinner, and his bespoke suit had been replaced by a rumpled shirt and a cheap tie. He was smiling for the camera, but it was a strained, hollow expression, the ghost of a smile on the face of a man who had once believed he was a king, Rel. I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not pity, not even a flicker of anger. He was simply a data point, a closed file, a failed experiment whose results had been logged and archived. His path was his own, a journey into the quiet mediocrity he had always feared. A fate he had ironically sealed by trying to impose it on me. I closed the article and turned my attention back to the blueprints on my screen, to the future I was building. He had shrunk, and I had grown, and the universe had corrected itself. A year after the locks were changed, I stood on the terrace of the penthouse. My penthouse. It was unrecognizable from the sterile, white gallery Julian had created. The uncomfortable leather sofa was gone, replaced by deep, plush velvet couches in a rich emerald green. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled to bursting, their spines a chaotic tapestry of color. The screaming abstract painting had been donated to an art school for students to paint over. In its place hung a vast, serene landscape of the Scottish Highlands, a place I had always loved. The space was finally a home. It was a reflection not of wealth or status, but of me. The terrace doors were open, and the sound of soft jazz and easy laughter drifted out from the living room. I was hosting a small party. My guests were not business titans or city power players. They were my friends. Clara was there, debating politics with the history professor I was now seeing. Marcus was by the bar, regaling my old museum curator friend with a story that was making her laugh so hard she had to wipe tears from her eyes. It was a gathering of authentic souls, a circle of trust and genuine affection. The professor came out to join me, handing me a glass of wine. "It's a beautiful home, Seraphina," he said, his eyes warm. "It feels like you." "It finally does," I agreed, looking out at the glittering expanse of the city below. I thought for a fleeting moment of Julian. I wondered if he ever looked at a skyline like this and thought of me. I hoped, for his sake, that he didn't. I hoped he had found some small measure of peace, some new, more honest life built on a foundation of truth rather than illusion. His fate was no longer my concern, his memory no longer a source of pain. He was just a catalyst, the necessary pressure that had forced a profound and wonderful transformation. He had told me I would have nothing without him. Standing here now, surrounded by genuine love, fulfilled by my work, and completely at peace in my own skin, I saw the beautiful, breathtaking truth. In taking everything he thought I had, he had inadvertently forced me to claim the one thing I had been hiding from myself: my own, undivided, and limitless power. The view from the top was magnificent, not because of the height, but because, for the first time, I was seeing it with my own eyes. And I was finally home. Years passed. The story of Julian Croft, the man who lived in a castle without knowing its queen, faded from industry gossip into something of a legend, a cautionary tale for the arrogant, whispered in boardrooms and at cocktail parties. For me, it became something far simpler, a closed book on a high shelf, its lessons learned, its pages no longer needing to be read. The professor and I built a life together, one based on mutual respect, shared passions, and the easy comfort of two people who had nothing to prove to each other. The Vance Foundation flourished, changing the city's skyline and the demographics of the boardrooms within it. My company thrived, not because I was ruthless, but because I was authentic, leading with the full force of my integrated self. One quiet evening, my husband and I were sitting on the terrace of the penthouse. The city lights below us formed a glittering, endless tapestry. He was reading, and I was looking through a portfolio of new designs for a sustainable community project my company was planning. He looked up from his book and smiled. "You seem happy," he said simply. "Truly, deeply happy." "I am," I said, and the truth of the statement settled over me with a gentle, profound weight. I thought about the two identities I had once held so tightly. Rita Parker, the supportive wife. Rita J. Morgan, the powerhouse CEO. One was a performance of diminishment, the other a performance of strength. The woman I was now, sitting on this terrace, was neither and both. She was simply Rita, a woman who had learned that true power wasn't about hiding or revealing, but about integrating. It was about owning every part of yourself, the ambition and the vulnerability, the boardroom and the living room, and refusing to let anyone, including yourself, put them in separate boxes. Julian's mistake wasn't just that he underestimated me. It was that he underestimated the very nature of strength. He saw it as something loud, something to be displayed and leveraged. He never understood the quiet, immense power of the woman who could build an empire and still find joy in a simple cup of tea. The woman who could orchestrate a corporate takedown and still feel a pang of sadness for the man she once hoped to love. The real reckoning hadn't been in the courtroom or in the vault. It had been within me, in the slow, deliberate process of tearing down the walls I had built inside myself. He had emptied our joint account, thinking he was taking everything, but in doing so, he had forced me to access a reserve of strength I had kept locked away. He had given me the unintended gift of my own wholeness. As the city hummed its endless song below, I closed the design portfolio. The future was not a blueprint to be finalized, but a living thing, an open space of infinite possibility. I had survived the collapse of my own carefully constructed world, and had emerged not just intact, but stronger, freer, and more myself than ever before. He had tried to write my story for me, to confine me to the role of a minor character in his grand narrative. But the best chapters, I learned, are the ones you write after you've taken back the pen. The heat in Phoenix was different. It wasn't like the humid, ambitious heat of Houston, a byproduct of industry and power. This was a dry, indifferent heat that baked the ambition out of a man, leaving behind a brittle shell. It was a fitting climate for the man Julian Croft had become. He now went by Jules. Julian sounded too formal, too grand for his new life. He worked in a beige cubicle in a low-slung office building in a suburban corporate park. The company was called Solara Tech, a small, renewable energy startup with big dreams and a small budget. His title was Junior Project Manager, a role that mostly involved managing spreadsheets and fetching coffee for the senior engineers. He sat in a weekly planning meeting, the air conditioner rattling ineffectually. He wore a polyester blend suit that was a size too big, bought from a department store clearance rack. He listened as his boss, a woman named Maya who was 15 years his junior, sketched out a plan on a whiteboard for a small solar installation on a new commercial building. The old instincts died hard. Julian saw an opportunity to assert himself, to reclaim a flicker of the man he used to be. He cleared his throat. "If I may, Maya," he began, his voice attempting the old cadence of authority. "I think we're thinking too small. This isn't just about one installation. It's about creating a new paradigm. We need to disrupt the energy use cycle of the entire commercial sector. We should be leveraging this as a flagship project to attract a higher tier of investment, to create a narrative of aggressive market penetration." The three other people in the room stared at him. Maya paused, her marker hovering over the board. She looked at him with the patient, slightly weary expression of a teacher dealing with a particularly slow student. "Thanks, Jules," she said, her tone devoid of irony. "But for now, let's just focus on getting the permits filed on time. We're a team of 7, not General Electric." One of the engineers chuckled. "Yeah, man. Let's just make sure the panels don't fall off the roof before we disrupt any paradigms." Julian's face flushed. The words, once so effective in boardrooms where confidence was mistaken for competence, sounded hollow and ridiculous here. They were the echoes of a language from a foreign country, a country where he had been king. Here, they were just empty noise. "Speaking of permits," Maya continued, turning back to the board, "the property owner is a real stickler for process. It's a big REIT out of New York. We'll need to submit the full proposal to their acquisitions division for approval." She tapped the board next to the property name. "They're called Argent Properties. It's a subsidiary of some bigger fish. Vance Holdings, I think." The name landed in the sterile, air-conditioned room like a bomb. Vance Holdings. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. The heat in the room was suddenly suffocating. For a moment, he wasn't in Phoenix. He was back in the penthouse, the eviction letter in his hand, the cool, dismissive eyes of Clarabelle boring into him. He was in the vault, standing before Seraphina, the architect of his ruin and the woman he had so spectacularly failed to see. He realized his colleagues were looking at him. "You okay, Jules?" the young engineer asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," he managed to say, the words tasting like ash. "Just a long night." He tuned out the rest of the meeting, his mind reeling. He had thought he had escaped. He had thought that by moving 1,000 miles away, by shrinking his life and his name, he could outrun her shadow. But he couldn't. Her empire was everywhere. It was in the very structure of the world he now inhabited. He was a minor functionary seeking permission from the vast, invisible machinery of the woman he once called darling. After the meeting, he walked back to his cubicle. On the wall, his neighbor had pinned up a cheap poster of the New York City skyline at night. In the center of the image, one building stood out, its unique silhouette, a beacon of glass and steel. The Seraphina. He sank into his chair, the worn fabric groaning in protest. He stared at the poster. At the penthouse level, where he had once hosted lavish parties and lectured his quiet girlfriend on the nature of success. He had believed he was the master of that universe. Now he knew he hadn't even been a footnote. Bon! The phone on his desk rang. It was Maya, her voice tinny through the speaker. "Hey Jules, can you grab me a coffee before you start on those spreadsheets?" "Cream, 2 sugars. Thanks." "Of course," he said, his voice a monotone. He stood up, collected her mug, and walked toward the break room. He was no longer a king, no longer a tycoon, no longer even a cautionary tale. He was just Jules, a man in a cheap suit, fetching coffee for his boss, haunted by the ghost of a woman who owned the world he had only pretended to live in. The desert had not offered him a new beginning. It had simply provided a vast, empty landscape against which to measure the true, desolate scale of his own nothingness. Years later, Seraphina stood in her true office, the vault, looking at a satellite map of the city on one of her monitors. Her empire had grown, but more importantly, it had changed. The Vance Foundation had funded 2 new architectural schools and dozens of affordable, beautifully designed housing communities. She dialed her assistant. "Clara," she said, her voice calm and clear. "I've made a decision. I want you to prepare the sale portfolio for the Seraphina." There was a rare moment of silence on the other end. "Sell the Seraphina?" Clara finally asked, her surprise evident. "But my dear, it's your masterpiece. It has your name." "My name is on the future now, Clara," Seraphina replied, a soft smile in her voice. "It's on the cornerstone of the downtown library we restored, on the scholarships we fund, on the blueprints for projects that serve communities, not just egos. The Seraphina was a monument to a battle I had to win. But the battle is long over." She looked at the monitor, at the iconic building that had once been her gilded cage and the stage for her liberation. "Its purpose is served," she continued. "It's a beautiful building, but it's a monument to a past I no longer live in. It's time to let it go. It's time to build something new." With a click of her mouse, she closed the file on her flagship property and opened another. The initial designs for a sprawling urban park, a green lung for a part of the city that had none. The past was sold, the future was unwritten, and she held the pen.